I am Nicholas Allen, Director of the Willson Center for Humanities and Arts. And we're a hub of research and creativity across and beyond the university. And I invite you at any time to join our community for readings, lectures, and projects that span from Athens to the world. In thinking of our many projects with our fellow citizens in the public research institution that we are, I want to begin with a brief pause to remember all of those affected as we meet with the challenges of this pandemic. Our gathering today is thanks to the Provost Seminar Series, and I want to thank Jack Hugh and Marissa Pagnataro for their leadership and for their important support of the humanities and arts, which are at the heart of any great research institution. And I'd also like to thank Will Richardson for his management of the technology and for all his help today. This lecture is presented in partnership with the Office of the Provost, the Willson Center for Humanities and Arts, the UGA Libraries, and the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences as part of our excellent Signature Lecture series. Welcome, Johanna. Johanna Drucker is the inaugural Breslauer Professor of Bibliographical Studies in the Department of Information Studies at UCLA. She is internationally known for her work in the history of graphic design, typography, experimental poetry, fine art, and digital humanities. She has written widely on digital aesthetics and in graphic design, among much else, and is a mentor and a leader in arts and humanities. When we announced Johanna would speak today, two of my wonderful young colleagues, Nora Benedict and Emily McGinn, wrote to me straight away to share their excitement and their experiences of connecting with Johanna before. And Johanna is here at the suggestion of my outstanding colleague in English, Sujata Iyengar, who is, among many other things, the Folger Shakespeare Fellow this year. Lastly, being an English professor myself, I was reminded immediately that we announced this talk that you'd been here before, Johanna, at the invitation of Jed Razula, whose award-winning work intersects with your own interests in visuality and experiment. Johanna will speak to us today on rethinking assumptions, the current values of academic work, a conversation as timely as it is necessary. After Johanna talks, I will ask an introductory question, after which Will share your comments and questions, which can be delivered through the chat function at the end. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Drucker to the University of Georgia virtually. Johanna.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the welcome. And I'm grateful for the chance to speak today, and thanks to your provost and to you, Nicholas, and to the Willson Center and the rest of the faculty and whoever else is present in this peculiar virtual environment. So as some of you may know, I was invited to give this talk more than a year ago. And at the time I was thrilled. I thought it'd be great to get back to Athens, Georgia. I haven't been there for some time. When I did visit, saw Jed Razula in his office for a literary event. But you know, a year ago, I thought, well, what will I talk about? You know, I might talk about my work in digital humanities and visualization, and I might talk about, you know, work in the alphabet and other things I will touch on here. But it was always topic focused. It was, you know, what kinds of work am I doing that might be of interest to a broad community? And how could I, you know, engage people in the multiple dimensions of the kinds of work that we all, or that I care about and that I think many of my colleagues care about. And that seemed like a great idea at the time. And then, well, let's face it, the world changed. And so we have been facing all kinds of momentous things in this last year. And I think that from the point of view of someone who's been in academic work for 40 years, I started my graduate work at Berkeley in 1980. This has been a year in which many of the things that I have assumed might exist for a long time in terms of institutional platforms, frameworks, and so forth are suffering and going to suffer. And that the challenges that we're going to be facing are such that it seemed like it might be important to address the fundamentals here and ask, you know, what are the values in our work, and what's the value of our work, and how do we see that in relationship to the possibility of radical transformations? I think that we can talk about the pandemic. We can talk about, political unrest and uprisings and social justice and equity and long overdue aspects of social change. But no matter what we address, we're going to have to deal with the economic realities and what that's going to bring to the university and how that's going to dovetail with political agendas that have long been waiting in the wings in terms of opportunities for transformation. And there's, no point in keeping the main issue that I'll be addressing here to the end. So the main thing I think that is going to be of interest and challenge for us is to address the fundamental question of the authority of knowledge and how that works and the role of the university within that particular arena of cultural life. So that will be a theme that weaves back through here several times. But meanwhile, I want to situate my own work in a couple of different ways. This piece in the New York Times by Leslie Bloom that appeared a few weeks ago was very timely for me in various regards. I am a humanist and I'm an artist, and you'll see that evident in the things I'm going to talk about. But I teach in the Department of Information Studies at UCLA, and that is a department whose core is a professional program, and our students are archivists, librarians, information classification managers, data experts, and so forth. So the activity of keeping the cultural record is central to what we are concerned with in terms of the expertise we provide and the work that we are preparing them to do. And in this article, Leslie Bloom began by saying, there's a joke going around on Twitter, and like most jokes on Twitter, it's not very funny, a joke going around on Twitter that says future historians, if they say that they work in the year 2020, will be asked, yeah, well, which month of 2020 do you specialize in? And again, I think we're feeling the kind of intensification and acceleration of cultural transformation at every turn. But the other phenomena I'm experiencing these days, here are two new books of mine that are, the book from Edition B42 came out just this spring, and the English language version from MIT is going to be out next month. And what I'm experiencing is, here we are in the midst of our work. I'm a mature scholar, I've been working for many years. I'm doing a lot of work now that's the culmination of many, many years of engagement. These are both books that reflect 20 years of, thinking about digital humanities, interpretation, the kind of epistemological and interpretive dimensions of this kind of work. So the work appears in 2020, but as we know, it's not gestated in 2020. Work has long histories. And so the moment of a work's appearance and the moment of a work's formulation are not synchronous. And this is one of the things that, is both interesting and problematic in this moment. And here's another book of mine that's coming out, a collaboration with Susan B. From Litmus Press. And like many of the books that I'm getting announcements for from my friends, it raises certain questions. I'm getting announcements from my poet friends and literary friends, to a less extent my academic friends, and their announcements of new publications are apologetic. The apology is, this doesn't feel appropriate now. And that sense of the before and the after, the what is now by contrast to the moment of original conception, is palpable. It's very present. And when Susan and I began this project, more than a year ago, the idea of fanciful engagement with princesses who are upset because they didn't have their own extraterrestrial vehicle seemed like fun, right? It's like, that didn't seem problematic. And it still doesn't on some level, but nonetheless, I think we're all aware that just as in our personal lives, we understand the befores and the afters that are marked by momentous events of marriages and births and death and loss and relocation and immigration transformation, any of the things that are definitive of periodization within our self-conception. So I think in a cultural sense, we are processing these moments in that regard. So the before and the after come into play. And that means that projects of long standing, and I'll introduce this here, but I'll return to it very, very briefly at the end. Another project of long standing for me that I've worked on for more than 40 years, for 40 years, is this project on alphabet historiography. And if we ask, what matters, what are our values? I love the alphabet. I'm very interested in the history and historiography of the alphabet. Knowledge about its origins, its transmission, its modification. Most people know very little about the alphabet. They'll ask, what alphabet? The Greek alphabet, our alphabet? So the fact that there's one source for the origins of the alphabet within the ancient Levant, and that it modifies, it spreads, it's adapted throughout a global environment. Into South Asia, it's the Tibetan alphabets, the Devanagari, into the use of Arabic, and into North Africa, and then into Europe and so forth. Stuff is not very well known. So I've been studying the historiography, that is the transmission of knowledge about the alphabet, for many years. And this book is also now about to come to fruition. And one of the key principles of the work of historiography is that knowledge changes as it's transmitted and as it's resituated. And here you see Athanasius Kircher's Tourist Babel, a kind of a decorative table with an escutcheon-like title area above, but it's a serious presentation of a compendium in tabular form of what was known at the time by Kircher about different script forms, different alphabetic forms. Interestingly, 20 years later, not even quite, we see this exact same table, stripped of its escutcheon on the top, resituated in the work of Willem Gorey, and resituated in a way that narrativizes rather than merely presents. And this kind of transformation, the sense that something changes dramatically by being resituated within a different intellectual or presentational framework, is at the heart of what I'm going to identify as the concept of historical parallax. Now, parallax, we know, is an optical effect of vision. It has to do with the fact that we have two eyes, and the eyes are situated a certain amount of distance apart. And therefore, our sense of three-dimensional space is created by the fact that those two views onto any particular object create a dimensional effect. But parallax is also used in a metaphoric sense to describe the fact that any object is constituted visually from within a viewpoint. It has to do with where we sit in relationship to it. So when I think about the table that Kircher presents and then Gorey's resituating of it, we have one of those moments of historical parallax. The object transforms by being seen from a different point of view and placed into a different conceptual, theoretical, historical, and rhetorical framework. So the concept of historical parallax is really the one I'm grappling with here, to think about how before and after transform our understanding of the value of what it is that we're doing and the values in individual projects and work. Another sort of guiding concept for me in thinking about this, and it's been one for a long time because I was influenced by Guy Debord early in my graduate work. I studied film and situationism, is the notion of the historicity of subjectivity. Debord, as some of you will know, and not all of you, was a figure who was part of the French avant-garde, international avant-garde, in fact, in the immediate post-World War II period. And Debord was involved in a movement called Cobra and then Letrism, and good friends with the polymath artist Asger Jorn, a Danish artist. But Debord became very active in the political scene that was part of the 1968 revolution, as it was referred to, in France and internationally as well. At the end of his film career, because he made several films, Debord made a film called Ingerum imus nocte in consumimur igni. We go around and around in the in the night and are consumed by fire. Now, the title is a palindrome. It reads forwards and backwards in the same, you can read it in either direction. And the film has a great deal of autobiographical material in it, and is a kind of melancholic reflection from Debord on what he felt was the, and this is 1978, so he should have stuck around, the disintegrated state of culture at the time. And one of the things that Debord is focused on here is, first of all, his kind of upset at the way in which his earlier work, which is a considerable classic and very influential, Society of the Spectacle, had become almost caricaturized in the way it was picked up and used by academics. Keep in mind, Debord was not an academic, he's an intellectual and an artist, so he's working from a very different point of view. But also crucial to Ingirimimus Nocte was Debord's notion of the historicity of subjectivity. And by that he meant two things. He meant we are always subjects in history. That is, we are situated within the kind of conditions of our own formation, culturally and temporally. But in addition, he says, we are subjects of history. We are constituted in the codependent dynamics of subject formation, such that we internalize certain assumptions about how we work as human beings, how we understand culture, how we accept ideology, and so forth. And that constitutive sense of the subject is so important for Debord in understanding and coming to terms with his own melancholy. And his own relationship to his identity as a historically produced subject. So that has been really always an idea that I've lived with and felt in terms of thinking about my own work and its formation. As I said earlier, time is a complicated thing. We think about it perhaps having a linear times arrow aspect to it, but we live multiple temporalities. And here there's an image of a film editing screen, just as a kind of example of the kinds of temporalities that somebody might be dealing with in that situation. But it's nothing to the multiple temporalities we all live simultaneously, right? So, our chronological age, our family lives, our relationships, our work lives, and so forth, multiple temporalities. And those are always at work in the work that we do. And so that brings me to a specific case study that I'm going to use to kind of focus the kind of next set of my remarks here. And that is to look at one particular project. This is also coming out. I'm telling you, this is like my year of harvest, right? It's like all this work is coming to fruition. That's so I can retire. Right, without feeling guilty for the unfinished projects. So this project is the one that I'm going to use to kind of take these points I've just introduced. Oneself as a historical subject, the conception of work within historical frameworks that shift and change, multiple temporalities within any particular project, its conception and execution. The historical parallax, how we look at something as we're going into it and how different it looks as we're coming out of it. So those are the kind of themes that I want to bring into this sort of little case study that will serve as a kind of concrete example of some of these more abstract notions that I've just sketched out. So this is a book. It's about a man named Elias, who's featured here in a Robert Delaunay image on the cover. And the title, as you see, is Metabiography of a Modernist, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. I came to this project in 1985. In 1985, I had a Fulbright fellowship to be in Paris to work on my dissertation. And I had come to that project through my experience in the small press world in California. I had been a writer my whole life in my own mind. And I had surfaced in a group of literary publishers and poets in the mid-70s around a place called the West Coast Print Center, where small press publications were being produced. And I became very interested in typography and in printing and in publishing and in books and book arts. I had published my own, oh, sorry about the deteriorated image here. I had published my first book in 1972, which is this book. The conceptual DNA of this book is about as complex as some, horde of medieval and Anglo-Saxon remnants. I mean, it is so peculiar to imagine how in 1972 I could have thought that, creating a book about the bat elf who took little children into the roots of a tree and did perverse things to them was the first book I should publish and give to my parents for Christmas. But that's a whole, story. But the point is, there I was, 20 years old, making a book whose conceptual frameworks went deep into Christina Rossetti, Goblin Market, the Princess and Curdy, George MacDonald, other kinds of childhood formations to surface. And again, that is what brought me into this world of literary publishing and activity. But by the mid-70s, which is when this little peculiar work was produced, letterpress, I was interested in visuality and the visual dimensions of language and the way in which graphical scoring and presentation played a role in semantic production. And that was what I was researching in Paris. I was looking at futurist and Dada typography between 1909 and 1923. So here, this Marinetti work is one of the classics, for better, for worse, of this particular period. So what were the values I had at that time, right? For me, research was a way to legitimize the creative work I had done, but it was also a way to begin to understand something more extensive about artistic and aesthetic engagement with language. So that was where I was coming from. In the world I was in, the literary world, we weren't writing about things. We were writing to use language as a material and as a form. So there I was in Paris. It was 1985. It was freezing cold. It was dark. It was winter. And I was spending my days at the Bibliothèque Littéraire Jacques Doucet, a very formal place, a fairly intimidating place for me. And I was looking at manuscripts and Tristan Tzara's work and so forth, and trying to formulate a theory of visuality as a semantic component, a component of semantic value in poetic work. And across the table from me was a young man from Santa Barbara, looked just like a surfer, blonde, handsome, blue-eyed, and he was breezing through Livre d'Artiste. His notion of reading had to do with setting up a wind tunnel through his gestures, letting them move along the table. But at one point I got up the courage and broke protocol, because you're never supposed to acknowledge in a research library that you even know what someone is doing. I broke protocol and asked him what he was up to. And we had a short exchange, and he said to me, oh, well, if you're interested, the short exchange went absolutely nowhere beyond that. But he said to me, if you're interested in typography, you ought to meet this woman, Hélène Stanislavich. What did I know? I didn't know who this person was. And he said, she is the widow of a man named Eliasd, the man of whom I've now written this biography. And, she loves to talk to people about his work and so forth. I didn't know who this was. Very little had been written about him at the time. So I made my way to 37 37 Rue Mazarine on a dark January afternoon, went through the cobblestone corridor to the escalier in the back and up the dark staircase, pressing that little button that turns the light on. And at the time, again, what was I thinking? I'm having an adventure. What do I know? I end up in a room with this woman, a very small room with flickering gaslight and one armchair and a small little hard chair that she brings over for me to sit on next to her. And this is Eliasd next to her on their wedding day, 1960 something, I can't remember. And she was tall, dignified woman. And I'm sitting in this room with her. And I realize on the walls of this room, of this little dark, flickering, gaslit room, are original drawings by Natalia Goncharova of Eliasd, and by Robert Delaunay and Alberto Giacometti. And it's 1985. Now in 1985, feminist theory had already begun to really sort of deconstruct some of the canonical notions of modernism, to take apart some of the kind of great man ideas of how we should understand the production of culture, and even to decolonize some of the Western paradigms. But there I was sitting in a room full of living history. This was a lived space. It's where Elias had lived. These were drawings of him by people who had known him. And so my sense of what the possibilities were here was boggling my mind. And Madame Stanievich, Hélène, wanted someone to write a biography. So I undertook this project, knowing nothing about the man and very little about his work. Now, he had been a Russian futurist involved in activities in St. Petersburg and Moscow. He'd gone back to his native Tiflis, Georgia, in 1917, and he'd come to Paris in 1921, and then produced the final of what was a series of 5 books in experimental typography and the invented transmetal language of Zaum, used by Russian Zaumniks. And here in 1923, and a page from the interior, is that final work. Now, we're in the realm of esoterica, right? I mean, Zaum is esoteric even to a Russian futurist scholar. And I can't read this. And in fact, even Andrei Markowitz, the wonderful translator of Stanievich, will explain that it cannot fully be read. It can be enunciated, pronounced, performed. But the point is that at the time, what I valued was the opportunity to uncover, to show, to examine, to be up close within an archive, to begin to explore. I had no larger conceptual framework except that. Who was this person? What was their work? What did they contribute to the history of literature and art and letters? Someone coming out of the avant-garde. I was steeped in the avant-garde. I grew up in the avant-garde. The avant-garde to us was the place in which the possibilities of transformation through aesthetic work seemed to reside. I no longer believe that, but I believed it very much at the time. So I followed the work of Elias and began to study it. And here was the first major livre d'artiste that he produced in 1940 after a hiatus of 15 years to have a family, make a living, and so forth. This has engravings by Picasso. He had produced it, finished it. You can see the date under the engraving is 38, but by the time the edition was finished, it was 1940. And World War II had begun. And Elias, this is one of those moments of historical parallax, was walking through the streets of Paris with this portfolio under his arm trying to sell it. And you could not sell a livre d'artiste in Paris in 1940. And he said even to take a place in the cafes meant to try to move around everybody's gas masks so that there was room for your coffee. So again, moment of conception, moment of execution, completely at odds. But again, I hardly knew this, right? I'm starting to piece together this story of Elias and of his work. He gets into a battle with Isidore Izou, the lettrist figure from Romania, who arrived in Paris right after the Second World War. This is a work by Izou. In response to this, Elias produces the first ever anthology of experimental visual and sound poetry. And he does this in 1949, and it's a who's who of figures who are part of that world. Klebnikov, Kruchenik, and others. So, you know, I'm again just trying to get a sense of this. And Elias's relationship to history. He has a strong sense of wanting to get the record right. He's annoyed that Izou doesn't understand there are precedents for the work Izou is taking up that precede him by 30 years. So again, this moment of kind of parallax. But on the other hand, you know, here's Elias proceeding and paying very little attention to events around him, right? He's lived through the First World War, the Russian Revolution, the transformation of the state of Georgia into and out of its relationships with Imperial Russia. He has moved to Paris. He has lived through, you know, it's like now he's gone through the Second World War. Historicity never factors into his self-conception. He doesn't talk about that. He doesn't factor that into any of his production. His work is conceived within a literary lineage and a literary genealogy in which authority is significant to him, both by his own work and by his associations. And again, 1985, 86, discovering his relationship with Picasso and his long-term friendship, this felt like something, even if I had already my feminist-induced skepticisms about the warrant for some kind of, celebrity author, sort of, well, just celebritization based on association. Still, again, there's a kind of blue chip artist sense of this. But again, as we move forward into thinking about how we rethink our assumptions, the value of that association and the value of that friendship get reframed and reframed and reframed. It's not that they don't matter, but the sort of larger context within which value is assigned and on what terms has shifted dramatically, at least for me. So Picasso, so he does these projects with Picasso. This is called La Maigre. It's based on a 17th century French writer, Adrien de Montluc. And again, it's, on some level, it's a very funny, clever book about a woman who's so skinny that, if you go to bed with her, her elbows poke holes in you. And now we look at it and think, really, like men thinking that it's funny to body shame a woman and that that's humorous, like your point of view kind of moves around. It might still be funny, but, hello, and again, Elias worked with many, many figures. Max Ernst is another. Again, this kind of pantheon of mid-century modernist artists. So as I began to finish up, and I'll kind of come to an end here and pull things together, so we can have time for questions. As I began to finish the project and to write the book, which I did by 1991, and what you're seeing here is a phantom. This was the book, Elias Dilias-Danievich and the Modern Art of the Book, was supposed to appear from an academic press. Changes in publishing, economics in that period meant that they cut their lists. But this was a book written when I was writing a straightforward man and his work, Elias and the modern art of the book. My argument was, here was the artist who used the book in a modern way as a material artifact, exploring it formally, conceptually, and, in terms of design and so forth. But by the time I had finished the book, I had various kinds of qualms. I had come to not particularly like the subject. I didn't know Elias, but I saw ways in which his relationship to his third wife, Hélène, were problematic in my mind. But even more, it was the sense that, what are the considerations that put this kind of work into perspective? How do we understand that? And what is a biography? I took biography almost as a given, but later I came to think, well, what is biography? Is it a character study? Is it a narrative of a life? Is it a read of a figure in relationship to context and conditions of their own conception and production? What is it? When I came back to the project last year to rewrite it in the form it currently takes, the Metabiography, I recognized that for me at least, what was interesting was the process of getting to know a figure through evidence, through the archives, through the reading of materials, through meeting people, through, adventures I had. I met Maurice Lemaitre, the lettrist, and had a very interesting set of exchanges with him. I met people who had been part of Elias's life, an old Russian white Russian prince who was sitting in the studio he had moved into in the 1920s. Who, with a mane of hair and his hand on a cane, and just thinking about what were their perspectives, what were the frameworks of history and distance within which they were sort of performing their understanding of this person and his work and its importance. So it was the process, it was the constitutive process of research around which a biography comes into being that came to be interesting for me. So the project finishes now in a very different place from where it started. Interestingly, the final book, conceptually, of Elias's career, there were a couple things that came after, is a book called Boustre Fedon. This is a page from it, which was also a palindrome, just like in Géramimus Nocte. So the sense of reflection, recapitulation, going backwards. And the way this works, because it was a kind of Zaum, sound language work, was that Elias wrote these poems in French you know, left to right, and then below, does the palindromic reverse so that they become sound poems? Again, as he's reflecting on these figures who have been so significant in his own life. This is a poem to Hélène, his third wife. So all of this is by way of saying that within projects, values change. My understanding of what matters, how to understand the foundations and assumptions of a work shift and shifted over time. And that would be true in any situation. That would be true whether we were in a time of what I consider to be major crisis or not. But we are in a time of crisis, in my opinion. I think universities will shrink. I think economic impacts will be dramatic. I think that there will be all kinds of changes. But when I think about this notion of values and put it in relationship to the concept of value, what is the value of the work that we do? On one level, I could say paying attention to alphabet historiography at this moment in time, is this really the most significant thing that we could be doing? Is the fact that a set of signs developed by Semitic speakers in a cultural exchange with their Egyptian neighbors to the south who spoke another branch of the Afro-Asiatic language, is this the most important thing to be tracing? Alphabet underscores Unicode. It's part of the global information system. This is fascinating and interesting. There's a cultural politics to the amnesia within which that Semitic past is eclipsed and erased, and the Afro-Asiatic origins of much of Western culture are erased and eclipsed. Yes, there's something to be said there. Those are the values in the work. But the value of the work is more important. And the value of the work, I think, is best addressed by channeling a statement made by my esteemed senior colleague, Alan Liu, at the University of California at Santa Barbara. A couple of years ago, in some context, which I forget now, Alan said, you know, the crisis ahead, because he's a digital humanist, it's not going to be about digital knowledge production or analog or anything. He says, the challenge is going to be who has the power to control the authority of knowledge. Where is the authority of knowledge? And to me, the current attack on the legitimacy of expertise in every single area, whether it's law, politics, medicine, epidemiology, the humanities, the sciences, environmental, climate studies, this is the challenge. This is the value of what we do. That no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, no matter what your field of expertise, if you are committed to academic work, its educational mission and its research mission, it should be, I believe, to preserving the value of legitimacy in knowledge production and the institutional and intellectual sort of frameworks within which that has warrant and potency in the world. So that to me matters as much as anything. And does that matter with something like the alphabet? Of course, because within a generation or two, we may have nobody left who can speak the ancient languages, right? It's like expertise matters and it doesn't come easy, it's work. And the only way for it to go on is to inspire and preserve students for a future generation, but also, again, through recognizing what I believe to be is the greatest threat to all of us, which is legitimacy of expertise within any domain. So I will stop there and see what kind of questions there might be. And I think I'm going to go out of my screen so I can see people. Is that all right? I'm going to stop sharing.
So Johanna, that was wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to ask you just a very brief question, and then I'll invite my colleagues to submit theirs to Will. He's opened up the chat function for that. It occurred to me that if you had no longer believed in the auteur du monde, you at least had gone on a tour du monde, and that the foundations of your work are in languages, in arts, in archives, and narratives. And that's very much the architecture, also the contemporary university, and something that we work hard to protect because I think it is fundamental. But so much of your interest had been in the avant-garde And we associate in literary study, and I think also in the visual arts, the avant-garde with the future. But actually, it's also to do with the emergent of that which is already there. And I wonder, would you speak a little bit, just briefly, if you didn't mind, about your new book? Because it is a work of futurity already realized. Its date of publication is a kind of gathering and is its own form of parallax, whereby all of these forms of knowledge that you've acquired and changed in your thinking about them has taken different forms. So I don't want to ask you a question about hope, but I do want to ask you a question about, in the process of your own re-becoming in this new book, would you give us an idea of where you think it itself is, avant-garde and gestures to futures that might already be with us?
Sure. Again, I said that I no longer quite believe in the avant-garde in the way that I was sort of indoctrinated, as it were, into it. I mean, for many years, I was part of the Church of the Avant-Garde, which really meant, subscribing to a set of beliefs about the extent to which intervention in formal systems of language, visuality, behavior, whatever, had transformative effect, political effect. And many claims were made for work within the community of artists that I was part of. And though I don't believe in that particular version of the efficacy of art, I believe strongly, and I would continue to believe strongly, in two things that are part of that. One is and I'm going to sound like a late romantic, but I'm interested in the power of imagination, because I think imagining otherwise continues to be essential for the Romantic project, which is not just the Romantic project. It has roots in other traditions of faith, which is to take the broken world and put it right. And if ever we had a broken world that needed to be put right and can benefit from imaginative engagement, applied imaginative engagement, it's now. But it needs to be imaginative, I believe, because otherwise I think we get caught in a kind of instrumental, mechanistic understanding that has its roots largely within the Enlightenment, in ways that have proved to have, disastrous consequences in various ways. So I think there's a lot to be said on the side of imagination. The other piece I would keep in mind that's related to that is what I call aesthesis, or the necessary, you can say it's a luxury, but it's a kind of necessary luxury in my opinion, which is to have the understanding of what generative and provocative relations to experience produce. And again, I've been reading a lot of John Dewey lately, a figure who had a curious kind of non-connection to the 20th century avant-garde in many areas, even though he was so crucial for education and for philosophy, pragmatism, the American philosophical tradition. But there is within Dewey, a conviction that what matters is experience, and that the quality and character of what he, considers to be experience is something that, the aesthetic dimension both provokes and represents. And in this, the aesthetic is not merely works of art, and Dewey's very clear on this. The aesthetic has to do with an approach to and an attitude towards being and perceiving and experiencing. And so, in terms of my values, and again, I would separate values from value. Values to me are my beliefs, anyone's individual beliefs, what we use to guide our behavior and our ethics and so forth. Value, I think, is something that is, I would hope, consensual, that we would believe in the value of expertise and knowledge, consensually, again, not universally or transcendently. And again, one of the wonderful things about Dewey and aesthetics is the situatedness of his model, that, experiences within conditions and circumstances that are lived. And this is also something I think is a tenet of ethical behavior, is to continually return oneself to the condition of the lived, empathically as well as individually. So though I don't believe in the power of esoteric poetry to bring down regimes, If that were true, Kenny Goldsmith's visit to the White House would have had a different effect. But I do believe in the more core, what to me are core principles which guide creative work, imagination, and experience.
Yeah, well, you're reminding me so very much of Yeats and his living stream, but we will take that up another day.
Okay.
I'm so grateful to you for today. Will is going to take things from here and
Okay.
share questions and say our thanks to you. But thank you.
We have a question here from Dr. Iyengar. If you want to, I can unmute you if you want to ask.
Yeah.
Question yourself. Go ahead.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you. And thank you for so much for coming. I mean, on Zoom coming, right? I was very interested in thinking about it not necessarily being a bad thing to have had a failed project or a project that didn't happen, but as a chance to rework it and rethink it. And so I'd love to hear more about the Iliage project and how it changed from being a man and his work to the version that's coming out this year. And then again, if you had to rethink it yet again, in light of this pandemic and where we are politically, how would you do this? And I'll tell you where I'm coming from personally as well, which is I'm a Shakespearean. I've been working for about 10 years, inspired by you and others, on a book about Shakespeare and artist books. And the critique I keep getting is Shakespeare's elitist enough.
Right.
How on earth can you be writing all this stuff about an even more kind of niche and elitist endeavor? And it doesn't matter how much I talk about the democratic multiple, people are not buying it. So anyway, I'd love to hear you contextualize your work. Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad you bring up the issue of elitism, because again, it's something that comes up constantly, and more it gets associated with notions of privilege, and, identity politics around privilege. But, just to touch on elitism for a moment, I'm a product of public schools, and the American kind of public schools. I went to all public schools except for 2.5 years of art school, and which was barely education, but it did me well. And one of the things I love about the University of California, which is where I got my doctoral degree and where I am currently employed, is that it is elitist education in the public realm, which means, by elite here means, really aimed at being the absolute best it can be and available as public education. So to me, the term elite in that regard really signals, and I know I'll get attacked for this all over the place, but to me, it signals a commitment to expertise. And again, the capacity to read, Shakespeare in relationship to traditions of interpretation, modification, transmission, reception. These are, essential skills for many kinds of activity, but they're valuable in their own right. And again, I will defend the idea of expertise against the charge of elitism, because if we want to do away with expertise in the humanities, we will easily open the door to doing away with it where it's already being under attack, which is within the sciences and law and politics and other domains. So, the charge of elitism, I find, I want to sort of turn to advantage as a badge of honor, which is to say, yes, expertise at the highest level of excellence, rigor, and careful thought is worth preserving and building and inspiring. I mean, my students are so determined to succeed as archivists, librarians. They want to do work in public libraries in 2020. I have so much respect for them and their interest in taking expertise into applied realms of service and committed, preservation of the cultural record. So, I guess if I were to rework Ilias at this point, I just finished it and this whole process of rethinking, I suppose I might put some, slightly stronger framing in it to recognize that even the kind of critique of modernism, critique of the kind of assumed role of white male masculinist artists should, be qualified to some extent. But I feel like in the realms in which I work, those qualifications are so much part of our common understanding. But it's not so easy when I'm dealing with, you know, the sort of some of the champions of this person's work who are still, and again, you know, I'm not going to be annoyed at someone for loving art, you know, and treasuring art at this point in time. But for somebody to say, well, he knew Picasso, as if, you know, by shaking the hand of Picasso, it's, you know, Picasso wasn't, you know, it's not the hand of a deity, right, of any kind. So, you know, I guess because I grew up with artists and writers and poets and academics and intellectuals, I think, yeah, people have talents and skills and they do interesting things. And the specificity of that is worthy of respect. But I have a really hard time with superlatives. I just, like, hyperbole, it just kind of sticks in my mouth. I mean, it's like some form of spell check, but it's speech check. Like I just can't say the word genius. It you know. So I'm really interested in specificity of cultural activities and formations, understanding processes, and the expertise for doing that judiciously. So keep going, keep going. Indeed, you know. So
that's great.
Yeah, it's a funny time.
We have a question from Bruce McEver. Bruce, I'll unmute you there. If you'll unmute yourself, you can ask your question. All right. I don't know if it's Ken, but I'll read it to you. So,
Okay.
So Bruce asks, how do you feel the current online Zoom learning experience will change the academy and education going forward?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it depends on, you know, whose opportunistic agenda gets served. You know, as far from the teaching point of view, of course, it's frustrating. There's no substitute for the dynamic of the classroom. And you feel a class. You can feel where they are and how they're relating to you, and getting to know students on a regular basis, coming into the room and seeing who's looking dejected and who's looking cheerful, and, you know, having that kind of incidental exchange. That's invaluable for human connection, and creating an environment in which people feel welcomed, appreciated, and recognized. And I think that's an important part of education. And my concern is that the managers of the educational business will see this as an opportunity to record expertise and then package it for, you know, distribution. And we know that's not what education is. And we know that. We who are educators know that education is a conversation. It's a dialogue. And there's always some moment in every class where somebody says something that you didn't see coming, that changes the conversation and allows you to rethink in front of your students, so that they see that you, oh, they don't, oh, yeah, oh, what, oh, you know, they see that, they see how the behavior is modeled, they see learning in process, they see rethinking happening. And so, you know, education is not about packaged content. It's about the dynamics of the social you know, relations that provide a context for people to, you know, again, feel engaged in every dimension of their being. And I truly believe that. So, you know, do we, you know, hate Zoom? Of course we do. Is it better than nothing? Absolutely. I take a lot of trouble with my students. I'm trying to meet every one of the students in my 60-person class for a few minutes before school starts, because again, just knowing who somebody is, like you and I had a very brief conversation the other morning, Will, and yet it's like when I saw you today, I thought, oh, I know that person, right? So again, I think the extra effort of creating social, you know, professional bonds is very important in Zoom. But, you know, again, the economic pressures are going to be to shrink the size of the academy and to replace what many people believe is kind of useless, you know, repetition of knowledge with packaged information. I will say, I think that there's a responsibility, and again, this will not make me popular, but there's a responsibility to us as the professoriate to really think about the privilege of our existence and to be willing to, you know, give back more. to the institutions that have supported us. So what other profession, has the kind of schedule, ownership of your own work and, support to pursue it that ours has? And it may be something we're going to have to be willing to compromise a bit. So, but it's not a rosy future. I mean, if you're looking for a rosy future, you don't want to talk to me. I have any predictions for rosy future.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I agree with you. I just think it has a real chance of democratizing the education process, and that is taking it away from the elite schools and quickly. It's unreal that Harvard should charge what they charge for an education when you don't have that interaction that you do have, with the professors. So anyway,
yeah. Well, the question
is going to change things. It's going to change things radically, I think.
Yeah. Well, again, supporting.
I very much enjoyed your talk, by the way. So thank you very much.
Thank you. What's your own area of expertise?
Oh God, I'm an investment banker.
Oh dear.
And I'm also a writer and a poet. So I've been on the dark side and I've come back. So as Nicholas knows.
Well, thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Nick, for holding this.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
Thanks for your question, Bruce. That's great. Yeah. Nora Benedict has a question. Nora, if you would like to ask your question, I'll let you unmute there.
Hi, thank you so much. This was a really fascinating talk. And I was just really struck. I know that you were talking a lot about the historically situated moment that we're living in and how all knowledge is historically situated, but I couldn't help but think as, a book artist, a typographer, how everything is also materially situated, right? And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit how our current moment is going to shift that not only historical moment and kind of the before and after, but also what that means for the material history that we're going to be researching in terms of how our access to archives is dramatically different, how everything is mediated now through the digital, how physical materials are based on potentially what we have around us, and also these lovely chance encounters in archives that we might have had to discover new projects are kind of evaporated.
Right. Well, yes, the whole serendipity of scholarship is a little bit compromised by the, mediated environment. But one thing I have to say that was so wonderful when I was first in lockdown this spring, in those first weeks when you thought maybe you shouldn't even bring the mail into the house. And it was like completely, my car didn't start when I went out to start it because it had been so long since I'd driven. And was that I could get access to incredible things electronically, digitally, through the networked resources. And I would be reading about, a discovery of an archaeological artifact that was happening in Lebanon in 1846 or 7, and be able to read a report of it in a digitized version of a London paper and an Albany, New York newspaper within several clicks of my research. And, that was, we know this, but still what that meant in terms of capacity to do research and move forward was amazing. The material changes that you're gesturing towards, of course, are many and too big of a topic for us to take up here in any detail. But one of the other talks I'm about to give is on artificial intelligence and the visual arts and machine vision and what I call aesthetic intelligence as a kind of counterpoint to that. And in the process of doing the research for this talk, I've ventured into the world of the artificial intelligence artists. And I don't know what you know about these folks, but it's really fascinating. And again, most of it is neural net activity. It's open to the public, and it's going to be in Lille, France. I'm pre-recording the lecture, and the talk is sometime like November 5th. It's DH Nord, DH as in capital D, capital H, and then lowercase NORD, and that's the conference. I think it's on November, like, yeah, 19th. Anyway, so I venture into this world, and again, I'm fascinated by, you know, AI and neural nets and convoluted neural nets and deep neural net, you know, and general adversarial. I mean, it's like a whole world, whole new vocabulary, and, you know, it's material. I mean, electronic things are material, and they're in their multiple dimensions and so forth. But what really struck me was the paradigm of the artist. That the model of the artist is much closer to these figures of TikTok influencers and what one of my students introduced me to last year, which are the Unboxers. Like, who knew what?
Oh, they're fascinating.
Was, right? Okay, so for those of you who, like me, are just hopelessly unhip, Unboxers are people who, you know, get commodities, bring them into their environment, and film themselves taking them out of boxes and going, oh, wow, right? Okay, so it's like they make careers as people who can exclaim about some, you know, brand name product. Okay, so what was so amazing to me was to realize that the self-construction of these AI artists is all as brands. They are brands first and foremost, and then they funnel their work through their brand. And that the whole kind of notion of the systems of production, reception, identity formation, self-commodification, and art production has just gone into this completely, like, extreme place. And that I found really interesting. You know, so again, it's the cultural formation of the, you know, practices of art that I think are really radically transforming. And it was pretty strange. I was kind of terrified, and then I was kind of fascinated. So, and I'd love to see what you think. I mean, I think you'd have an interesting take on this. So, you know.
No, it sounds, I'm excited to go to the second talk on November 19th and hear about how all the kind of deep webs and potentially some allusions to Unboxers will show up.
It's just fascinating. Yeah. So who knows? Yeah. Anyway, thanks for your question.
Thank
It's
you.
nice to see you.
You too.
We have a simple question from Isabel Wallace. If your upcoming talk is open to the public?
Yes, I believe it is. It's, again, I think what the date currently is Thursday, the 19th of November. The panel will be from 8 to 10 Pacific time, so that'd be 11 to 1 your time. And it will be, again, there'll be the pre-recorded talk will be available, and then there'll be a panel discussion with some other folks that day. I'll do a little brief statement. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
That's great. Okay, if anybody else.
Dewey is going to come back in that conversation. Dewey and Adorno are going to be in conversation in that talk. I just have to say one little other anecdote that I didn't put in the talk. So when I'm working on a talk like this, you know, I'm generating it for weeks, and it's on my mind and it comes into my dreams. And so I had a dream this week that Guy Debord was talking to me in the dream, and he was there. And then Samuel Beckett showed up and said that he wanted to be in the conversation as well. And I thought this was really interesting, because to tell this story assumes that people will know who Guy Debord and Samuel Beckett are. And I thought, you know, just even that is such a kind of set of frameworks within which to, you know, put an anecdote into play. So I didn't put the anecdote in the talk, but it is also interesting that, I mean, Beckett really, he had things to say.
That's great. Does anybody else, I just want to give people a chance, a few more minutes, if anybody else has any other questions they've come up with. If you could either put that in the chat box or raise your hand. we have time for maybe one or two more questions. All right, Charlie Friedlander has a question here. Go ahead, Charlie.
I loved your talk.
Thank you.
I'd love to hear it again. So I was wondering if there is a way that this has been transcribed.
Yeah, Charlie, it's recorded. So a final recording will be posted on the Provost Signature Lectures page. Most of the signature lectures this year, of course, are being recorded when we have permission from the speaker, which is almost all of them. And so Dr. Drucker has graciously given us the permission to record this and post it. It may take a little time. Usually we try to add captioning for hearing impaired, et cetera. But we'll have that posted as soon as we can. So you'll definitely be able to watch it again.
That's great. And that will include the slide deck as well?
Yeah, it'll be a representation of exactly what you saw here. Right.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your interest.
It looks like we have another question from Dr. Iyengar, if you want to go ahead.
Great. Yes. Sorry, I don't mean to hog the conversation. So I would love to know what you're working on now in terms of your creative work, and not to oppose, obviously, scholarship and creative work, but are you working on any artist books? Are you making anything? Are you printing anything? How are you printing, if you're printing?
Yeah, I'm mainly painting. I stopped printing letterpress, some years ago. I had printed letterpress for 40 years, and I decided to stop with stochastic poetics. And I love doing stochastic, and we still teach with the press. Then I did a number of projects, one with Brad Freeman called The Fall, which started at the end of 2016 in relationship to events I refused to even speak aloud. And in that project, I was really interested in teaching myself to write like a compression algorithm. And, I thought I wasn't interested in using machines combinatorically or procedurally, but in understanding the subject position of an algorithm to see what it might be like to inhabit that space where you take lots of prose and compress it. And so that book called The Fall was a combination of newspaper headlines from the front page of multiple newspapers once a week for the first 25 weeks after that unspeakable event, and then the first 25 chapters of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, and also in a compression algorithm. And actually, I can send you a copy of it. I have a few copies. I'd be happy to send it to you.
I would love one. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So, that was very interesting to me. I'm sort of finished with writing like a machine. I enjoyed it. I used it for a couple of projects. I have stuff. I've been so busy with these academic projects, honestly. It's been the year, as you can see, it's been the year of way too much. So there's other things I'm working on, but mainly in terms of creative work, I'm painting. That's where I find the kind of right ergonomic relationship to creative practice, scribbling and painting. So, right.
Do you use oils, tempera, or watercolor, or do you
watercolor?
Mix?
Yeah, graphite and watercolor are my favorite, things. Like I do these little portraits here. So, like this was a little a portrait I did recently, and I'm just interested in human physiognomy and stories to be told. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway, but I'll just, you're Department of English, right?
I'm the Department of English. Yes, thank you.
All righty. So.
We have another question from Genevieve Guzman. Genevieve, if you want to ask your question, I'll unmute you there.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Dr. Drucker, for your extraordinary talk. It touched on so many spheres. I could barely take notes fast enough, but I was wondering, you mentioned that Elias had or did not integrate a sense of historicity into his self-image. did that become problematic for you as the project wore on? Was that an ethical conundrum?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. So he did have a sense of the historicity of art and literature and of his place within it. But it was almost like the historical backdrop didn't factor. He didn't think of himself as within those events. If he internalized those events, they were mainly within the kind of restrictions on personal choice, that he couldn't go back to the Soviet Union, but even that he didn't really write about. And so no, it was more of an intellectual question, which is, how do you write about somebody in relationship to these large forces of history when they themselves don't seem to actually, sort of include that in their own identity or self-identity? So that became fascinating to me in terms of biography. So, it's like, again, what does it mean to write a biography? What are you doing, right? Are you, you're creating a narrative of someone situated within what and how? And, how do you understand, that individual in relationship to these larger social forces? So I was like, I can't say anything about this. I can talk about the fact that I couldn't say anything because there really, was no registration within nothing registered in his own notes or, discussions or work where that could have been pointed to as evidence. So it was fascinating to me, right? It's like, how much do we think about ourselves in relationship to historical events? And I think all of us have before and after moments. I mean, I'm old enough that, the Cuban Missile Crisis was an afternoon I remember. And walking home from school and thinking, our bomb's going to fall. When are the bombs going to start? And so, there you internalize those things as processes that become fears, that become part of your larger understanding of what it means to move from one condition of historical circumstance to another. But he didn't seem to register, if he did, it was only that he couldn't sell his books in 1940. And that was it, and then move on. So it was a question, it's like, how do you deal with that? Have you ever written a biography or done any kind of biographical study?
A little. I never thought about it in those terms. It was actually a modernist project. It was Susan Rosenbaum's Lloyd project, a digital humanities project. And we wrote many about 500 word biographies for that. But for those individuals, we did Paris, and they all had a sense of their own historical moment. They had the sense that they were making history.
Right.
History.
Right. Yeah. So again, the self-consciousness is something you can point to. But again, it's so interesting. I would say when I was in the literary world of the Bay Area in the 1970s, when I was first surfaced into that world and got to know people who are still in my life, there was a definite sense of history, that they were making history. But again, it was within literary terms. It wasn't a history in relationship to the ongoing events of the 1970s. I mean, in 1975, people might have had political beliefs or activist beliefs or whatever, but they weren't talking about themselves in relationship to Thatcher-Reagan neoliberalism as a formative aspect of their own work. Now, there were people who are definitely activist in political ways that were very clear and motivated by larger global and historical forces. But again, it's like, it's just such a huge question. What does it mean to locate an individual in history? It's a huge question. And that was what I came up against, right? Yeah.
So he had a more timeless sense of himself.
Well, again, I think he had a definite sense that he was doing work that, would be important for all time. But again, within literary lineages, it was very important to him in 1949 to make sure that the history of that early work from the teens would have a presence within the record. So that was historical. But did he register that work as, the 19-teens was, from 1913 to 1917 was part of a period in which like major other things are going on in Moscow and St. Petersburg. No, Zaum is never conceptualized as part of a period of global conflict. Mayakovsky, on the other hand, Shklovsky, right? Totally different in terms of how they're thinking about poetics, poetic activity, and literary work in relationship to, what's unfolding. So again, just a different sensibility.
Thank you.
It's really interesting to think about.
Well, I think unless anybody else has any additional questions, which we just have a few more minutes, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else, Dr. Drucker. Oh, we have Dr. Iyengar had one more comment. Here, did you want to?
I can't really see what it says.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was allowed to comment. No, I'm just chiming in to say, listen, talk about the avant-garde. It's my biggest regret from college that I didn't take the avant-garde paper. And it's because I was put off by a tutor who thought I didn't have the background for it. And so it really resonates with me as a person of color and someone, I grew up middle class in England, but I didn't have that kind of European background or whatever.
Right.
But to hear you say that this is access, we need access for everybody, is very rings very true for me. It's very resonant.
So funny. I was put off of doing a Renaissance dissertation by my advisor, who thought I didn't have the background for it and pushed me toward the avant-garde.
Oh, that's hilarious.
I wanted to work on Athanasius Kircher, and he said, well, you can't do that, right?
And I love the fact that you're working on this early modern stuff now, and I'm looking at artist books and the avant-garde.
Yeah. So exactly. Well, so
thank you.
You never know. As scholars, we're lucky if we have long lives and can pursue many, many areas of investigation, and it is a privilege, and I appreciate it daily. But it's also work and a commitment. And again, I will say that the great privilege of this part of my life is to have the students I have in the program in which I work, and to be part of a great public university. And I believe in the necessity and value of public education, and I will not falter from that belief, I assure you. So I thank you. Oh, is there one last quick question from Charlie Friedlander? Yeah? You have to unmute, Charlie.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Unmuting is so...
Another very simple question. Do you teach undergrads or only grad students?
I don't get to teach undergrads very often because we're in a professional program, but I teach them occasionally, and I will be teaching a course for undergrads this winter called History and Practice of Information Visualization to engage with undergrads, and I know it will be fun. So I've taught so many different kinds of students in so many different kinds of institutions, and I've always enjoyed the students in different ways. But there is this particular group of professionally oriented students is very gratifying to teach. So anyway. All right. Well, I think maybe, shall we wrap up, Will?
Actually, I just wanted to amplify just one thing that you said. I want to thank you, and not just for the intellectual value of your talk, but the social value. I tell people all the time that it's critical that we have a world-leading public research institution in Georgia that's open to all its citizens in the most diverse of ways. And I say also that the thing that makes us competitive with any private institution, no matter what its endowment, is the breadth and value of the social connections that we have. And what you've also done here today, and I want to thank the Provost for enabling it, is to bring us all together. Many of my wonderful graduate students are here. We have our wonderful faculty who are the equal of any institution in the world. And many of the people who support us, some of whom have asked you questions today, and who not only understand, but give value to the humanities through the Willson Center and through the college, are all here. So I'm always sad that I don't get to see everyone in person, but I want to recognize you're the reason why I'm here, and I'm very grateful to you all for taking part today. Will, thank you. Johanna, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
And Johanna, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Provost and on behalf of UGA for joining us today, for participating in the Provost Seminar Series. And then also thank you to all the participants. Like Nicholas said, thank you for your questions and for participating, for the great conversation. And as I mentioned, I just want to remind everybody it will be recorded, and we'll post that as soon as we possibly can to the Provost Signature Series website so that people can go back and review. And you can, of course, share this with any colleagues or friends that didn't get a chance to sign on. So Dr. Drucker, again, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah.
Take care. I'm sorry not to be able to visit the campus, but another time ahead.
Another time, hopefully in the after times.
In the after, exactly.
Everybody have a great weekend.
Bye.